during our lunch hour and take you back to SOM. As you can see, I'm in the new building, which kind of looks like a spaceship. And I've designed this webinar to be kind of like a journal club so that you'll feel like you're in a classroom again. So a little bit on what we've been doing here at SOM about systems thinking and social change. I'm relatively new here. I joined a year ago and I'm part of the program on entrepreneurship. And I've been overwhelmed positively with the appetite at SOM for tackling social challenges in a systemic way. Around this time last year, we organized a convening on systems change education in a management context and brought together educators from graduate and undergraduate universities across the country and globally to think about how we can train students in systems thinking in a way that they can apply that to create change in society. And so today we'll be using the Learning Alliance and the School Foundation as examples of systems entrepreneurship, and then opening it up to you all to hear about your work and the challenges that you're tackling, and hopefully walk out of here in an hour feeling like we learned something from each other, and that as a group we're collectively more able to go out there and apply these methodologies. So just to introduce briefly the article that we shared about emergent learning. This article poses the question, how can we go beyond planning tools to expand agency, encourage experimentation, and support whole system learning? And the authors were trying to define emergent learning as more than just having an adaptive strategy, but really a process through many interactions whereby individual entities or agents create patterns that are more sophisticated than what could have been created by an individual entity, such as the Learning Alliance alone or School Foundation alone. And as a corollary, no one entity, whether funder, grantee, social entrepreneur, or expert, could have envisioned the entire solution a priori. And they provide an example from the Learning Alliance, which is the Moonshot Moment. And this is the movement that the Learning Alliance created to build the systems respond to literacy challenges. So they, rather than coming at it with their own strategy and their predetermined theory of change, they asked the question, what will it take to have at least 90% of our students reading at grade level by the end of grade 3 in 5 years? And they brought together every community stakeholder in Florida's Indian River County, including teachers, principals, police, parents, faith-based leaders, sports coaches, doctors, real estate agents, etc., to think about the challenge from her or his perspective. And each was given the opportunity to envision what it would take to make this ambitious goal a reality. So I'd like to kickstart the conversation by inviting Barbara to tell us a little bit more about this initiative and where it stands today.
Thanks, Teresa, and lots of gratitude from the Learning Alliance and the work we do, and to both you, Dawn, and SOM. I think the work we're talking about is symbolic of what we went to school for, trying to change the world and make it better. So TLA really is a grassroots organization that was started by parents whose kids were failing kindergarten. And I was one of those parents. And, you know, when your smiling, bright, shiny-eyed kid comes home and suddenly the shine's gone from their eyes, and the teacher is saying they're not performing, but they can't tell you why, you know, your first reaction is shame, blame, you know, teachers, and then sort of curiosity, what's going on? And so that really started a journey with a friend of mine whose kids weren't reading either at, you know, the private schools in town. And along the journey, you know, my background was Bain and Company. You go look at best practices. We traveled the country, brought them back, and got the former president of AOL on board with us, and, you know, began asking a lot of questions. So shame, blame turned to curiosity. And the emergent learning that you're talking about, I really think is a set of tools that builds our capacity across a system, across a community, and within ourselves to turn from shame, blame to curiosity and frame everything as a question and a quest. So the Moonshot Moment really was the Learning Alliance saying, you know, the kid is at the center. We need to bring everybody together. We honestly started within the schools, and we honestly thought we were going to solve the problem in 4 years, and raised money from social venture capitalists for a small set of work to bring in research-based best practices and train teachers. And what really emerged from the work was that this is a very complicated problem, that, education starts at birth, not at 5. It would take everybody in the community to get off the bleachers and onto the playing field. And that's schools, that's, civic leaders, it's citizens, it's philanthropists. And our question, what does it take to create a culture of learning such that we can get 90% of kids ready for kindergarten and reading by 3rd grade? And I think what started for us personally about our kids who were suffering with learning challenges, grew to a very foundational question. And 3rd grade reading, after we started and launched this Moonshot Moment, Moonshot Moment was based on John F. Kennedy saying, let's get a man to the moon and safely back. There's no blueprint. So we got to learn together. And, what that really led to was understanding that 3rd grade was really the canary in the coal mine for the future of our communities, our country, our competitiveness, as well as keeping the light shining on the kids' eyes. So really what's happened over the last 10 years is we're still in it. We've had systems movement, which has, gotten lots of national attention from the National Campaign for Grade Level Reading. But what we're all learning across the country, there's 400 communities now working on 3rd grade. So it was no longer the journey of 2 crazy moms and a philanthropist. It was verified as something that our nation needed to tackle. Only 36% of our kids across the nation are reading on grade level by 3rd grade. And that's when the lights shut off, because we learn to read so we can read to learn. So anyway, that's our work. Our collective impact movement is called the Moonshot Moment, because we know there's no blueprint. Luckily, along the way, we ran into this vision-driven emergent learning, process, which was unfolding as we were unfolding. So we became one of the first test cases for it. And Fourth Quadrant Partners is a beautiful organization that is really helping us systematically learn to build growth mindsets, to build learning into our organizations and our cultures, to help navigate across organizational boundaries where hierarchy and authority won't move work forward. So really, our impact over 10 years, we've had over 100 organizations meeting monthly for now 8 years. The work that we do in the room emerges from our learnings. We probably have 17 new innovative programs ready to scale, but not necessarily with the funding to do that. So that's leading to new funding initiatives and collaborations amongst our funders. We have 17 promising practices and 5 early in the piloting pipeline. We've gotten a lot more alignment. Our data in the last 4 years has moved from 53% proficiency to 60%, which it's not 90%, but it's above the state average, and our poverty levels are, 10 percentage points higher than the state. So we're moving in the right direction. And I think, one of the key things is getting people to turn breakdowns into breakthroughs. That when it breaks down, that just means we're at the limit of the system, and it requires leaders who have growth mindsets and forget shame, blame, and get curious. So we can talk more about emergent learning yesterday, but it's a great process to do that.
Okay, thanks so much for this introduction. And I have more questions to ask you, of course. But first, I'll turn to Dawn for a few minutes. So Dawn, this article says that, the field is in need of a framework to operationalize emergent strategy to help funders put down the chess piece and join the team on the field. And they mention how this is humbling for funders and how most foundations don't really work like this. So I'd love to hear more about your work at the Skoll Foundation and whether you've been able to integrate these practices.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa, and thanks, Barb. First, I'll say a bit about Jeff Skoll and the foundation to sort of set the scene for how we thought about the work that we're doing. I'm new here, so I'm inheriting been here 6 months, and really am on a learning journey myself. And the article is very helpful because it frames a lot of what we're thinking about as we evolve the strategy. But Jeff, who was one of the first employees at eBay, left after 10 years and really decided he wanted to make a difference in the world, and went out sort of on his own emergent learning quest to figure out how to make a difference. And he met with John Gardner, who is the founder of Common Cause. And John said, if I had your money, I would invest in great people doing great things. So people like Barb and many of you on this call who have a vision for changing the world. But they really spent time formalizing what that meant, and took what was then an emergent concept of social entrepreneurism and really made it the cornerstone of what the foundation has done. So we've invested in over $500 million over the last 20 years in social entrepreneurs who are tackling some of the world's greatest problems. Jeff actually created 3 organizations at the time. Participant Media, which is a production house dedicated to producing narrative stories of social change, both documentary and narrative. And they had their best year ever last year with Roma, Green Book, RBG, and On the Basis of Sex. So really, Jeff had a belief that you can't create change without being able to tell a narrative. He created Capricorn, which was, before the term impact investing even sort of had taken off 20 years ago. They were investing in emergent technologies around the environment, around healthcare, that would lead to a sustainable world. And then created the foundation, which I've been blessed to take over, to really invest in social entrepreneurs who were, as Barb said, looking at problems and trying to find solutions. And we've tried to do it in a way that is different than most other foundations at the time. The grants we give are for people who have a proven model of change and they're trying to figure out how to scale it. And the awards we give, the Skoll Social Entrepreneurship Award, is an unrestricted 3-year gift or award that really enables organizations to scale. And then in addition to investing, we try to connect them. We hold the Skoll World Forum every year, which is in Oxford and has about 1,400 people attending, to really bring together the field and talk about the challenges of social entrepreneurship and to have that emergent learning across many sectors. And then finally, Jeff's belief in narrative, we try to tell the stories of the social entrepreneurs and invest in the narrative part of helping them get their vision for how to change society out there. So that's sort of where we are, and we're now in a strategy review that I can talk more about as we dive in.
Okay, perfect. So Barbara, you mentioned that you have 17 innovative programs ready to scale and proven concepts, but don't necessarily have the funding to scale. And Don mentioned that this is what Skoll Foundation invests in. And I'm wondering, you've gone from 53% to 60%, and your goal is 90%. Is it just the funding that would help you scale these models, or what does it take to get to the 90%? Could you please talk about the challenges that you're facing, and how do you think they can be overcome?
Yeah, so, I think the key challenge, with collective impact and systems work is really one of really cultural change, right? We're trying to go from a world that was used to hierarchy and authority and do what I say, to a world that really unlocks the wisdom from the front line. And how do you do that in a way that is aligned and around a problem that you want to solve? So Heidi Goober, who was our, consultant behind this work early on, always said, well, have you hit a breakdown yet? And I'm like, oh no, we're beyond breakdowns. We're doing better than that. And she said, well, you're not in the real work. So I think the real work of alignment is the hard work. And, I think McKinsey did a study. Don used to work for McKinsey, so he may be familiar with this, but about 10 years ago, they said that the reason educational reform was not working internationally is because of the political cycles. The school board and superintendents were replaced every 3 years. And so a promising practice comes in place, and then somebody else comes in. 3 years isn't enough time to change the cultural practices, to get the alignment, to create, the systems change. So we keep going through this Groundhog Day. And, we've seen that not only with school board and superintendents, but also with leaders of the nonprofits, who are doing the work. So I think where we are, we're really sort of at a tipping point. where, you know, we've really got a process. We're educating. The Learning Alliance really is in the professional development practice, both in the front lines of the school teachers, educating them, as well as our community leaders. But what happens when they turn over, and what happens when our school board and superintendent turns over? And in our 10 years, we've had 4 different superintendents, and we've survived. The Moonshot Moment goal has been written into their job descriptions. But we really know, as you said, it takes everybody on the playing field, and that includes elected officials. It includes funders who have wanted to fund programs that they can go back and say it worked, as opposed to, you know, can we fund learning? So we're really in the spot of getting it to the next level. How do we create a vision which is held by the entire community? You know, charter schools, public schools, parents, unions, superintendents, that will survive past me, past the current superintendent, and past the current school board. And that's where we've gotten in this emergent learning work, right? It's got to be, I go back to America was founded with, you know, citizens running the government, not with delegating responsibility to the government and thinking it's being taken care of. And so on a local level, how do we grab back the power? And, you know, it's not a privilege, it's a responsibility. And I think that's what, you know, we've got a ton of retired CEOs and the like here who are funding this work because they know we need to move to the next level and really fund learning. And that's what's made the Learning Alliance unique and able to survive. But most of our nonprofits are not based on that. They're not based on funding that allows them to experiment. So how do we develop a vision which is held by everybody is one of my challenges. And how do we create the funding models that support the stuff that does emerging, both the learning when because you fail. In order to learn, you have to fail before you can, you know, find something that's scalable, and then scaling it. And our community is in the midst of all of that right now.
Okay, I'm gonna invite people to start sending me questions. I have one last question that I want to ask, and in the meantime, I'll see what you all are sending in. So Dawn, you're in the middle of creating your new strategy right now. How are you thinking about these questions, and what are you held accountable for in terms of saying this worked versus saying, you know, we have created learning?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We are, so the biggest question we are struggling with, and we do evaluation all the time of all of our awardees, is how to magnify the impact quickly. And given the severity of the world's problems, how do we pick where to place bets? So there are, you know, unfortunately, there are more problems than there are foundations to solve them, or to invest in great people who are solving them. And our challenge is figuring out where to place the bets. How do we measure whether we're successful in doing that? And I'd say the other thing that's very apropos of what Barbara's been talking about is most social entrepreneurs created their organization or their vision because they saw a failure of market or they saw a government failure, and they stepped into the void, much as Barb has tried to do in education. But to be sustainable and have success in the end, as Barb was saying, you have to get either government or the market or both to work together to adopt those solutions. And there isn't a great track record out there of that happening across many of these organizations. So what can we do and invest in as a foundation that stimulates that real systems change and helps people connect across those boundaries? And that we're very early in that strategy work. I think there's also, you know, there have been a number of critiques recently of philanthropy that we're also spending a lot of time trying to figure out how we address, and whether it's winners take all or Rob Reich at Stanford or Edgar Villanueva. They've all made very persuasive arguments around making sure that the investments we're making are not perpetuating an unjust status quo. And that's a big part of the work we're looking at trying to address right now.
So I have the first question here from Jean, who's asking, given existing funding models, reporting models, accountability models, how can an organization work with one foundation, such as school, using the emergent learning model and others still using the existing models? Barbara, can you speak to that based on your work? You're trying to create this new ways of doing things, and yet are you restricted by certain funders and the way they're working right now?
Yeah, so I think the Learning Alliance, given my background, when we first started, we said we cannot be in the typical, fundraising business that most nonprofits are involved in, my community and probably communities across the country. So we did have a social venture capital model, and not everybody can do this. We happen to live in a community which has probably, unfortunately, one of the biggest divergences between wealth and poverty. So 70% of our kids are on free and reduced lunch. And I have people that I can tap for social venture capital to experiment. I don't have people I can tap to scale the work. So the conversation going on in the community is, let's get people clear that there's three phases. There's a phase of pure experimentation, and you have to allow that to happen. People have to have hypotheses for action. That's what emergent learning helps figure out. Get the wisdom in the room. What do we know? What's the data say? What's our hypothesis for action? Let's act. Let's learn from acting. And then, those things get willowed out or winnowed away or whatever it is, to things that are working and scaling and modify. So I call those promising practices, and then some's ready to scale. And so we're beginning to talk to our community of funders. What are you actually funding? And most people are funding $10,000 to $25,000 grants, which is all about experimentation, not about scale. So the community is now rising up and looking at some other best practices in Florida. And part of them are they're developing children's services councils, which, despite the anti-tax bias of our nation, is actually communities are taxing for 0 to 3rd grade, birth to 3rd grade investments. And when people begin to realize the importance of birth through 3rd grade, I honestly had no idea how important it was to world-class education or to social justice, to immigrants who are coming in where English isn't their first language, or to people who are born into poverty. When they arrive at school, they're 2 years behind, and schools can't catch them up currently as they're structured. So anyway, we are, as a community, looking at some of those models to actually get public funding in. We did look at social impact finance, and we can talk more about that too, because Teresa, I know you are interested in that. And while that offers some national funding or state and more local funding, really that's about, once you've got a proven practice, it's not about the learning and piloting necessary to get there. So, there is some cannibalization of funding worry that we had when we brought that in. So anyway, I don't know if we fully have the answer yet. And part of emergence is okay not to have the answers. The issue is to be on the playing field, to have the best voices in the room. And can you imagine if we could unlock the wisdom of all the parents in the community about what education really means and what their role is in it, birth to 5, and help support them in that? It could change everything. So I think part of this is not just funding, it's also unlocking the intelligence of the front line, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher. And there's a lot of issues in our schools that need a lot more coaching and support. Knowledge teachers don't have that they need. And, so it's waking up. I think the system is waking up in all kinds of places. And so again, I think emergence is about, we don't necessarily know the answer that's going to come. We just have faith that if we walk forward together, unlocking wisdom and learning, that the answers are going to come to us. And I'm okay with that.
I have a comment and a question from Liz, who says, I think what Barbara is saying is we are trying to institutionalize a learning process. With that said, we have work that is ready to grow the connections and the work across boundaries, with the understanding that we are all pushing the boulder uphill together. With that said, I would love to know, how does the School Foundation measure success in the projects they fund?
So we actually look to the entrepreneurs, and the measures that they put forward is the measures of our success. So, in each time we fund across a number of areas and a number of geographies, one measurement would not work, or one evaluation system would not work for everything we do. So in each case, You know, if we're working with partners in health, they have very specific measurement and goals that they tell us this is what we're going to try and do with the money that you've given us, and that's how we measure our success in that area. If it's Teach for All in Africa, they provide their own set of measurements. We also work with MSC that's trying to create sustainable fisheries around the world, and they have a very different set of measurements. So there's not an easy answer to the question. We really are looking at, in each case when we do our awards, we're asking for how do we measure this?
And building on that, Don, I have a question from Nadim who asks, who's wondering if you have some initial thoughts on how philanthropy might shift in response to the criticism you mentioned about the winner take all.
Yeah, I mean, the criticisms are quite, they each have their component. So winner take all is actually not that inconsistent with what we've been trying to do, which is only invest in entrepreneurs who have an answer to changing an unjust equilibrium. So if it's going to perpetuate an unjust system, then that's probably not where we're going to invest, even though much of that work could be very powerful, feeding people, whatever it may be. We're focused on where there's a change in the system structure that will create a new and more just equilibrium. And if you sort of strip away and listen to Anand's podcast, that's sort of where he's been pointing. I think the other challenges are making sure Rob Brackett's critique of philanthropy has been, it's really not accountable to anyone. So therefore, what value is it in society? And his answer has been, it should be the engine of betting on new ideas and innovation. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do at the foundation as well.
So you both mentioned creating this bigger vision, and I have a question from Nate who asks, what do you think are the top challenges to get to a shared vision across the ecosystem? For example, power structures, policymaking, incentives alignment, etc. And Barb, I see you smiling, so I'll give this question to you. And he also asks, what are the brightest spots to overcome these challenges for the entire system, such as new philanthropic models and adoption, etc.?
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in the question, excited by it. Emergent learning would, say, what does it take for us to create a vision that navigates political cycles of, nonprofits and an education system, the public education, such that we can create a culture where our kids are thriving by third grade and graduating from high school and becoming productive citizens that have the 21st century skills to thrive. So the fact that he asked a question is great. Where we are in the midst of that is my hypothesis is that, we've done a lot of visions, in microcosms. The union might have their own vision. The school board might have another. The superintendent hopefully is aligned with the school board. The community has a third. And, what does matter in education besides, in Florida, it's FSA scores. It's a multiple choice test, and the community is asking for more. We want literate, creative, compassionate citizens who are going to improve our world. So we really are about to take it to that next level. And I've been talking to, some other folks. I think if you look at the environmental movement, they created a vision and then articulated it through rubrics about, what does a green building look like? And they put a certification around it. If you look at healthy food systems, there's been work that's been done which defines what are the values. Social justice is part of the values of a healthy food system, and they define the values first, and then they create a vision, and then they create what basically are rubrics to help people who are in the battle understand how to move along it. So we are literally in the process of, we've done reverse visioning forever. We're starting to try to create a rubric. What does it look like for a parent if they are operating at a high level to help their kids succeed by kindergarten, because we help what's going to accelerate learning. What does it look like if you're a teacher or a principal or an elected official or a city councilor? Because a lot of people now understand the importance, but they go, what can I do and how do I need to behave? So I do think, visioning is done at a high level, but can also get done at a more discrete level. And I was just on a conference call yesterday about trying to explore that and build off of some of the work that people have seen elsewhere. I think the challenge with the rubrics is that it doesn't become a dead document. I've had teachers who have done rubrics for my kids, and I go, well, how did you look at the rubric before you wrote the paper? And they go, well, I didn't really understand it, right? And that's a tops-down, compliance-oriented, problem that we see all the time in schools. So how do you create something or allow it to be a live process where people are creating it?
We also see these types of things all the time in philanthropy. When I was practicing venture philanthropy, I used all those types of rubrics like log frames and budgets and things that would really constrain the social entrepreneur's ability to experiment and fail and constrain our ability to fund learning. And I think that really ties back to Nate's question about the bright spots versus the challenges in creating a shared vision. And I know, Dawn, that you mentioned you were working on this also, on helping to connect across boundaries, on getting governments or markets to work together. What are some bright spots that you've come across in terms of new philanthropic models, or what are some of the top challenges that you faced in building this shared vision?
I mean, it's interesting. I'll use an example. There's an organization called Vision Spring that realized that one of the most effective education interventions you could have in Africa and in developing countries was actually getting eyeglasses to children. And the founder of that organization, Jordan Casselot, was working at it, raising money, won the Skoll Award, and then reached a certain point where he said, I could spend all my time trying to work in this one organization trying to change this, or I can step out and create something which he did called the I Alliance, which decided to work across government, business, and all the NGOs in the vision space. And the success that he's approaching right now is working with the government of Liberia, who's realized that this is an incredibly effective intervention. He's partnering with private sector partners who are providing the glasses cheaply. They're training all of the primary school teachers in Liberia to do the eye test so that they can provide the glasses to children. And it's an example where he said, I couldn't have pulled all this together in my organization, but by stepping back and with the experience he had, he became a systems entrepreneur and really looked across the whole system and identified ways to do this. I think that's an emerging theme that we're starting to see in a number of fields, both in the US and overseas, where there are people who instead of trying to run their own organization and make change are becoming the sort of the orchestra director or the activist to stimulate the change. And that's a new area that we're looking at investing in because there's not a lot of philanthropic capital invested there right now. I think the other piece of this, which is still a very early experiment, but there are a number of collaborative philanthropy efforts right now where a number of funders are coming together to pool capital, and so that you're not driving whoever the grantee or awardee is. I want you to do this, I want you to do this, I'm going to measure you this way, I'm going to measure you that way. They're coming together, so whether it's Co-Impact, Audacious, Blue Meridian, 100 and change, it's big pools of capital coming together for somebody who has, or a group of people who have a plan to change a system and investing together to give them the capital that probably no single philanthropy could do on their own.
So let's talk about funding models for collective impact. So you both agree that, grants are I mean, grants can get some, maybe help create a backbone organization to orchestrate collective impact, test new models, but eventually we're going to need to innovate in the actual funding vehicles. And Barbara, you mentioned social impact bonds. I also have Namrita from the audience who mentioned impact investing and wanted to ask about the role of philanthropy in catalyzing impact investing to expand resources available. I will broaden that question to ask, how can we expand resources available beyond philanthropy, whether it's impact investing or social impact bonds or other? What are some innovative financial vehicles that you've come across that could fuel collective impact? And are there any pitfalls that we should be aware of?
Well, there's an old-fashioned one called government. And the trick, having served in government a few times, the incentives in government are highly aligned against innovation. Taking risk in the public sector is very difficult. So one of the things that some people in the philanthropic field, including myself, are trying to think through is, how do we incent innovation and change in government? Results for America, which Michael Bloomberg has funded, is an example of this, where they're highlighting successful government adoptions of innovation and giving recognition to those who are willing to take that, as well as providing case studies for other government officials who are willing to take that kind of bet. So I think that is a very interesting development. And on impact investing, it's a whole field that needs some more definition. If impact investing means market rate return, which is usually how most impact investment funds describe what they're doing, we believe in, and others have started doing this as well, that there's something below impact investing, whether you call it, PRIs is the foundation, the technical term for foundations, but there's also catalytic capital, where you're not looking for a full market return, but you're looking for 0 to 5% as a way of crowding in other private sector money. I think this is all still very early in its evolution. And as a philanthropy, we have to ask ourselves very hard questions about, is that the best place to put our money, given how scarce philanthropic dollars are? And what's the trade-off between putting money there, doing a straight grant, and how are we also ensuring that we're just not enriching private sector investors and diluting our impact by doing so?
And Barbara, have you come across any scenarios where private sector capital was mobilized alongside government programming in education in Florida or elsewhere?
Well, I think in all of our work, we've been working across, public, private, and nonprofit funding streams. Just the traditional model, I think, as I said earlier, is not really about funding innovation. I do think that to build a learning mindset, to build a growth mindset, to build, an emergent learning culture requires that people come in before it's ready to scale. And so preserving that funding stream and understanding where it comes from. In our community, it's come from philanthropists and from the school district and from the county. We've actually had people picketing our county commissioners and saying, you guys need to give more money and get involved in this game in a different way than you have in the past. And we actually tripled the government, funding. Now, was that sufficient? No. Was it a starting place? Did people, rise up and say this matters and we need to do something? Yes. But I agree with Don. I think, government doesn't like to innovate. And one of our, promises is to create more transparency around learning and impact, so that people are willing to invest in both phases and get more explicit about disciplines for creating ways people can come in a way that they want to come in. But, again, let's just learn through good hypotheses, when right now I can't promise you we're going to have a positive outcome, but I can promise you we're going to have learning that's going to get us there. And then there's the pool of promising practice showing up, it may not be enough for the market-based hurdle rate that social impact funds need. And then there's the stuff ready to scale. But I am wary of bringing private capital in just to get some sort of market-based return. I think we do, to make government more accountable through more transparency. That's something that we're trying to do as a third-party catalyst.
And this is just one of the things I think the other side of this equation is, how do we make businesses operate in a more inclusive fashion? And I think, the recent announcement by the Business Roundtable showed that people are starting to wake up to this. We funded an organization called B Labs, that's helping to drive, and now is passed in 34 states, an alternative, the B Corp, which is an alternative that lets you, in your charter, get rid of, make shareholders not the primary focus, but a balanced focus between your employees, your community, and your shareholders. And I think there's an interesting evolution now, and we at Skoll are looking to invest in other groups that are helping drive that kind of change. We've done it with Ceres and MSC, as I mentioned before, around fisheries, but that are really trying to create sustainable markets globally to drive change.
And these are really the systems entrepreneurs that you're talking about.
Exactly.
I've seen you interview some of those people, Teresa, on some of your podcasts.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks for the shout out. I have a couple of questions from the audience. So I need to pick which one I'll go with next. I think that I'd like to talk about variation. I have a question from David about how can unique regional, social, political, and market idiosyncrasies be honored when striving to expand and replicate a system to scale? And I will broaden that question to make it not just about once something is ready to scale, but going back to what Barbara said, the innovation happens before it's ready to scale. So how have you seen a lot of variation, Barbara, in your work? You're on to now 400 communities, and you're trying to scale nationwide, but how do you take into account this type of variation?
Well, I think this is the beauty of emergent learning, right? I know when I started this journey 10 years ago, I'm like, okay, I need to figure out the program that we're going to put in place here that can be scaled. And emergent learning will talk about propagating ideas and processes, right? So we have gone to Minneapolis and sort of launched a Moonshot Minneapolis, and I'm talking to a superintendent in Maryland tomorrow who's just curious about our process. And, so I think we've gone from a scalable program to, you go to these other communities, there's amazing stuff happening in them, but they don't know how to align, how to come together, and how to, work across organizational boundaries in such a way that they become an unstoppable team and more powerful in service of children and education, right? So emergent learning's tool set, to me, is what you're scaling. You're bringing in different questions, but you're honoring the situational variability that you find in different communities.
And you're working within One Nation. I wonder, Dawn, when you're working with social entrepreneurs that are trying to scale and systems entrepreneurs trying to scale beyond One Nation, let's go back to the I-Lines, for example. How do you take into account the unique regional, social, political, and market idiosyncrasies when you're trying to expand like that?
I mean, it's, first of all, thank goodness I'm not the one who has to figure that out. The social entrepreneurs have to figure that out. But the best ones, we believe, do a lot of, some of the principles of what Barbara's been describing, where they contextualize what their innovation is and figure out how to get, by working with local communities, figure out how does this fit in the context of the community. And quite often they don't. There are many innovations that will work in India but may not work in Africa, where there's an organization called Pratham that's had some of the most incredible success with teaching early learning education, reading and math in India. And they've had to, even going from state to state in India, figure out what changes do they need to make. They're now taking Pratham to Africa, and they're spending a lot of time working to try and understand, find local partners who can take sort of the basis of their innovation, but figure out how to make it appropriate for the communities that they're moving into.
So when we're thinking about this type of systems level entrepreneurship and the types of organizations that are trying to bring together different stakeholders to innovate beyond one organization. I joke with my students that we call it extrapreneurship, because people say, you know, entrepreneurship is when you're building this new organization, and intrapreneurship is when you're innovating within an existing organization. So extrapreneurship is when you're innovating across organizations. And so we've talked a little bit about the principles and concepts and the financing of collective impact. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about organizational structure. I have a question from Nadim who's asking, what is the organizational model of collective impact, such as the I-Alliance? How is it different from an organization? How is it different to run an organization that brings other, does I-Alliance, for example, differ from an existing organization that works to bring other organizations together?
So go on, Barb.
No, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
I think this is actually one of the things we are, and maybe Nadim has the answer and we should just get him on the call.
I suspect that might be the case.
But this is one of the things we are trying to figure out right now as part of our strategy review. What does it mean to be an extrapreneur? How did you say that, Teresa?
Extrapreneur.
I can't even pronounce it.
It doesn't exist. I just joke with my students.
I like it. We may, plagiarize. But what does it take, whether you're a systems entrepreneur? It's an emerging sort of area where we're trying to understand what are the characteristics of an organization that does that. But it actually, and what is the type of leader who does it best? There's another group called New Profit that had done a fair bit of work in this. In the US, and is really trying to help define it, and we're sort of following and learning from them as they try and sort out what is the right organizational form and how do we describe that.
And I know that FSG has done some work on collective impact and has a really prescriptive formula where they talk about creating a backbone organization to then manage the collective impact. And I've talked to some collective impact people who have done work starting with the FSG model, and many, many years later are now saying we need to go beyond something so prescriptive. This helps get started, but then how do you keep the momentum going? So I guess this would be a question for Barbara. How do you create continuity and keep the momentum going when you're working 10 years later on this problem and making progress as you go? And in some ways the stakeholders are broadly the same, and in other ways the composition is constantly changing.
Yeah, we actually created a model last year. We tried to bring more visibility to what is collective impact, and we took the FSG, the five, the shared agenda, the visible and explicit data, aligned activities, et cetera, and we said something's missing. And I think FSG based it on Strive and some other models, and they even said something's missing. And what's missing is the learning that goes on behind it. And what is powerful about emergent learning is when you merge that as the C in which you do make sure the collective impact conditions are in place. Emergent learning it constantly amazes me how it brings people together, how it turns breakdowns into breakthroughs, how it gets rid of shame, blame. It allows a growth mindset and learning to happen at all levels. And so really it's about forming good questions and getting the right people in the room to address the question. So I would bring Nadim into a room and have him form a framing question around, what does the structure look like? Because I think the Learning Alliance is that structure, and we are constantly struggling with funders who who say, well, we don't fund collective impact. We don't fund this type of learning. And so thank God I've got some social venture capitalists who are willing to allow us to do it and have this conversation. So now we have posited a question in the room for funders. How do you guys fund in a collective impact way that allows emergent learning to happen? But I truly believe that that is part of the answer. And I would love to have a follow-up with, you guys and Don and Nadim to, really flesh out what is it that we have and we've developed and what have other people haven't developed to, really be successful in this. But I do think it's about leadership and exemplifying the values. And we have some new things we're putting in place to make sure that every new leader who comes into Indian River County is trained on these principles such that they change the culture within themselves and within their organizations and within Indian River County.
Thank you for bringing it back to emergent learning and circling back to a lot of the principles that you talked about earlier in terms of when there's this change of leadership, how can you make sure that they exemplify the values, and how can you create this change in culture that you both mentioned is necessary to keep innovation going across sectors. And in our last few minutes, I think I'd like to talk about measuring impact. I have a question from Nathan. Could you please both talk through each of your respective institutions' approaches to measurement of the returns and social impacts of your social impact investments? And I know, Barbara, you mentioned you work with social venture capitalists. Usually when I hear a term like that, I think they're expecting financial and social return. So how do you deal with that?
I mean, it is, if it's not a challenge that I threw out there, but it's a huge issue in education, right? Because in bringing more accountability, and Florida is a very, very high stakes accountability driven state right now for education. And it all rests on a test that kids take, starting in third grade, in May. And their success or failure on that test in third, fourth, and fifth grade drives school grades in Florida. And schools are considered to do a good job if they get an A, and if they get a C, they've done a bad job. But I think, as most of us in the field know, it's more highly correlated with levels of poverty in that school, and who are the ones who have high poverty levels, high levels of English as a second language, and are breaking through. So one of the things that we found, and it's gone across the system, and we talk about bright spots, is birth to 8. One of the most important learnings that we've had over the last 10 years is it's not really about learning to read. It's about getting kids within the right mindset to feel socially, emotionally connected to themselves and to their schools, so that they are in the right mental health framework to be able to receive any type of learning, right? So we now have that as part of the strategic plan in our schools. Social emotional learning is, deemed one of the strategic levers, and they are busily trying to figure out, how do we measure that? So it's really easy to measure a score in a test. It's harder to measure it. And I have some funders who say, well, measure it through, surveys, and measure it through testimonials, and I have other people who say that's a bunch of garbage. The only thing that matters is the test, the score on the annual test. So we do talk on the Learning Alliance about we should measure what we value. I wouldn't say that the whole investor community yet values the same thing or understands what precedes, successful test scores. So I think it's a great question, and we go one investor at a time and try to meet their needs.
Yeah, and just to pile on to what Barb said, there's some areas, take health, for example, where evaluation is fairly evolved. You can do an RCT, you can actually find the statistics on, whatever illness or child malnutrition, whatever it may be. The field has evolved pretty well, and you can evaluate those things quite precisely. When you start funding more in systems change or collective impact, it's very hard, because you can't directly, if you're succeeding, the system is changing, but it's hard to directly attribute that change, because there's way too many variables in a system, to any specific intervention that you created. So it's an area of evolving thinking, and it's even harder when you're talking about human capacity building. In order to change a system, quite often you need to invest in new talent in that system, even in education, teacher training, bringing new people into the education system. Very hard to do an evaluation of that whole system and what caused the change. And so this is an area as a funder, we're constantly looking to how do you improve the differing measurement systems for each type of problem. And again, looking to the organizations that we're investing in to say, how are you measuring your success? So that we can not impose a whole nother set of conditions on them, but try as much as if we believe in what they're doing and their vision for success, measure them the way that they measure themselves.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left. I feel like there are so many questions I want to ask you both, but I think I'll take this opportunity to start wrapping up. Just quickly reviewing what we talked about in terms of emergent learning and how the Learning Alliance has applied that to third grade reading in Florida's Indian River County, but more broadly speaking, how the Skoll Foundation has also applied that to creating a shared vision to support systems entrepreneurs around the world and the common challenges that you've both faced. I think that I do hear an appetite for follow-up conversations on both financing and organizational structure, as well as measuring impact. So maybe we could arrange those in some shape or form. But I'd like to ask you each if you'd have any closing comments, just under 1 minute each.
I just want to be very thankful to the people that allow us to do this work. So the National Campaign for Grade Level Reading, Ralph Smith and Ron Fairchild at the national level have really been great, supporters for making this work go forward. In my own Vera Beach, Ray Oglethorpe, and our deep philanthropic funders, again, the Skoll Foundation, how they invest is not how most people invest, and our social venture capitalists have allowed us to do that. And to all the leaders in Indian River County who've been willing to put their skepticism aside and come together as a group and really try to solve this problem. I mean, it has to be a joint effort. While we can be a catalyst for change, we cannot do it alone. The schools cannot do it alone. It really requires people stepping up and doing things differently, and that's challenging to all of us. So, and Liz Remington's my co-founder with the Learning Alliance, couldn't have done it without her. So, and Yale SOM, this just is why I went to the school and what I love. And so it's kind of interesting. How many years later, I don't even want to think about it, Don, that we're back here talking about it. But it is a
couple of years later.
Yeah, it's my heart and soul. And I'm so thankful for people like Don and our classmates who really care about this work. And here we are, Teresa, you're supporting it this many years later. So I really appreciate that.
And Barb, should people email you if they'd like to get involved with the Learning Alliance or continue this conversation on any of these topics?
Absolutely. I mean, we would love to have an emergent learning conversation in any of the 3 areas that came up today. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Don.
And I obviously have to thank Jeff Skoll for giving me this incredible opportunity to work here at Skoll, but also want to thank you, Teresa, and just angry you came, however many years after Barbara and I left the school, because there wasn't a course like this when we were there.
I was busy graduating from the 5th grade when you graduated.
You didn't have to go quite that.
I've been calculating it in my brain this whole time.
Little depressing. But hopefully with age comes, some degree of earned experience or whatever you want to call it. But, very excited to see, Skoll actually created the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship at Oxford. And at that time, it was the first place teaching social entrepreneurship. It's now become, I think Teresa, you may be able to correct me, I think there are at least 20 business schools that now have either courses or professors teaching social entrepreneurship.
And we're all connected through the global network of advanced management.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and very exciting to have learned from all the alums in our class who are trying to change the world in their own way as well. So just grateful to be on the call.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to the 56 people who are still online. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.